you very much. And good morning to you all, and welcome to our first Australian Institute of Energy seminar for 2020 on this wonderful Perth morning. My name's Murray Meaton, and I've been brought off the reserve bench as our state chairman Genevieve Simpson has been laid low with the cold, and we don't need any jokes about not enough coronas. I was fascinated to find in this age of wonderful technology yesterday that I got a message on my phone from my car insurer saying the place that I usually park my car is likely to be hit by a thunderstorm this morning, and you might consider your car's safety. It reminded me of the power of technology. I welcome our distinguished speaker, Jessica Shaw MLA, who has been a friend of the Aie for quite a few years. It's wonderful to have her back. There's never been a better time to talk about energy. The latest report on the health of the East Coast electricity market, released by the Council of Australian Government's Energy Security Board, talks about a lack of strategic direction, barriers to entry and constrained competition. Those three phrases are what gets us economists really excited. Today we have the opportunity to look at the health and plans for our own electricity sector. Well, that's the one on the West Coast, which doesn't form part of the NEM. We're delighted to see a capacity crowd this morning. You can see we are full up. We initially decided on a breakfast function to start the year off, and we anticipated about 50 to 80 people. It's a testament to our speaker and the importance of this subject that you have tripled our expectations. We believe the Australian Institute of Energy provides the best networking in Perth for the energy sector. Please enjoy your breakfast and the opportunity to meet with your fellow energy people, and I'll be back to introduce our speaker. Thank you very much. Thank you. If I could have your attention, please. Thanks very much. We're running, obviously, to a very tight schedule. Breakfasts give us a limited time so we can all get back to our wonderful desks. Jessica Shaw is the WA Labor member for Swan Hills in the Legislative Assembly and chairs the Parliament's Economics and Industry Standing Committee. There's a job that I would really love. Before entering Parliament, Jessica was a commercial executive in the energy industry for over a decade and enjoyed a prior career in foreign affairs as the political and economic attaché to the British High Commission. She also worked as an advisor to the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee. Jessica has 4 degrees, including a Master of Laws from the University of Cambridge. Would you please welcome Jessica Shaw?
Thank you and good morning. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this morning, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you very much to the Australian Institute of Energy for the invitation to speak to you today. I've been a member of the AIE for quite some time, and in fact, at around Christmas time last year, was very honoured to be made a fellow of the Institute. It's quite comforting, really. It was the end of a very long, very painful year. I was in the throes of writing this report, and it made me think perhaps I had a credible exit strategy if I needed one, if this gig didn't work out. Thank you, and I just hope I don't give you buyer's regret. Can I acknowledge the Honourable Eric Ripper, former Treasurer and Minister for Energy. I particularly acknowledge the significant contribution that Eric made in the early noughties in the energy reform space. His vision and determination started WA on our energy reform journey, and having been through this inquiry and now in my 3rd year as a Member of Parliament and party to a number of different conversations about energy reform, I have a far keener appreciation for just how significant an undertaking that was, and what an amazing achievement it was to have established the market structures that we now have. I think it's fair to say that since Eric, we've not had a minister prepared to undertake meaningful, significant reform in the energy sector until now. I think we now have a genuinely reforming energy minister, and I am certainly very excited to see where he takes energy reform. So, the Economics and Industry Standing Committee, this report, as many of you will be aware, is a product of the committee process in the Legislative Assembly. Our committee has 5 members, myself as the chair, the newly elected deputy chair, Terry Redman, David Honey, Yasma Barakai, Stephen Price, and the former deputy chair, Sean Lestrange, who just co-opted onto the committee for the finalisation of this report. So it is a bipartisan or multi-partisan. Terry always corrects me when I say bipartisan. It is a multi-partisan committee. We oversee a broad range of portfolios. So as you can see here, a really incredible range of topics that we could choose to inquire into. And in fact, when you have a look at the inquiries that we have concluded over the last 3 years, we've been pretty hard-working, and we've produced a range of topics on some really challenging, range of reports, on some really challenging issues. Regional airfares, smash repair industry, obviously our interim report for this inquiry, the Airbnb inquiry, which was really hotly contested, the most controversial inquiry that the Legislative Assembly has ever tackled, with a record number of submissions. And then this report, and following on, we've not no flies on the Economics and Industry Standing Committee. We've just initiated an inquiry into Western Australia's economic relationship with the Republic of India. This inquiry, this microgrids topic, has been particularly complex, and this is probably our most expansive report on our most complex topic, and I just want to acknowledge the contributions made by my colleagues, particularly Terry Redman. If anyone, if you're ever sleepless and you want to have something mildly soporific, do have a look through the Hansards of the evidence that was given to this inquiry, and you'll see just how engaged members were, particularly Terry. And I want to thank the members for working so collaboratively and constructively while we tackled some really quite potentially contentious issues. This inquiry could have gone one way or the other, but my colleagues engaged in a very meaningful and constructive way. So on our terms of reference, when the committee sat down to discuss its work program at the end of 2017, I suggested microgrids as a potentially interesting topic. I thought it'd be something interesting, and we could examine what seemed at the time to be somewhat of a fringe energy sector topic: the emergence of distributed energy technologies and their application in various sized energy systems. Since this inquiry commenced in February 2018, it's fair to say that microgrids and distributed energy resources are now front and centre in our state and our nation's ongoing conversation about its energy future. Our terms of reference were quite deliberately broad. We examined how microgrids and distributed energy technologies could contribute to the provision of affordable, secure, reliable and sustainable energy supply, both in metropolitan and in regional Western Australia. We also considered a range of opportunities along the value chain, and then examined key enablers and barriers. In terms of the evidence to this inquiry, we received 41 submissions, 9 supplementary submissions. We held 8 briefings and 40 hearings. We actually also, as you can see there, I travelled to Singapore and took a range of briefings with energy market participants there, and the committee travelled to the United States, where we really were the beneficiaries of such incredible engagement and openness, frankness, from a whole range of different both private sector entities, regulatory agencies and political stakeholders as well. We also engaged legal expertise with Mr. Matthew Bowen, who the committee was so pleased to engage, and Matt and I spent a lot of time kicking ideas around, and it was really a fabulous experience to be able to do that with Matthew, and certainly the committee gained immeasurably from Matt's insights and knowledge. We undertook the inquiry in 2 stages. The first stage, we looked at technical and operational issues, tried to give a bit of an overview of the energy market and examined the value chain opportunities. And then in the second half, we had a deeper dive and examined market and regulatory reform issues. I'd like to personally thank all of those organisations who were so very generous with your time and who submitted to the inquiry, and the hearings were fabulous, and that's because I believe the industry is so engaged and genuinely looking forward towards reform. The interim report for this inquiry, published in April last year, found that WA is home to some of the world's most innovative, groundbreaking energy technologies that are radically changing the way we produce and consume electricity. Western Australians have embraced renewable energy, as I know everyone in this room is aware, installing household-scale solar PV panels at an incredible rate. As I'm sure many in this room appreciate, household solar is now the largest single source of generation capacity in the southwest, in the Swiss, and is 3 times larger than our single largest power station. Whereas previously the electricity industry operated on a unidirectional flow of electricity from centrally controlled large-scale fossil-fuelled power stations to largely passive consumers, the sector's dynamics are fundamentally changing as the prosumer emerges. Individuals who produce and consume their own energy from renewable sources from both within and at the fringes of the network. As advances are made in ICT and unit costs come down, there's a growing level of interest in orchestrating these assets and combining them with household and grid-scale batteries. A range of innovators in the WA energy sector are facilitating these changes and developing large and small-scale renewable and distributed energy projects. The state-owned energy utilities are pleasingly leading the way and are particularly well positioned to facilitate the changes underway, given their line of sight from molecule conversion and electron production right the way through to the sale and consumption of electricity to individual households and businesses. The GTEs are partnering with the private sector and universities to deploy these assets across the state, demonstrating the operational feasibility and the benefits of the technologies. Our final report, published just 2 short weeks ago, considered these innovations and took a deeper dive into market and regulatory frameworks and considered whether they were helping or hindering the consumer-driven transition towards a more distributed energy economy. We have found that as they mature and working in conjunction with traditional generation and network assets, microgrid technologies can act as reliable, dispatchable resources, supply essential services to the system, and act as balancing resources. They can also reduce total system costs by deferring or reducing entirely removing the need to invest in costly pole and wire replacement programs. Their ability to provide these benefits depends, however, on market and regulatory frameworks. The final report's pretty meaty if those of you have had an opportunity to look through it. So I'm going to very quickly clip through the report now, and then Matt will facilitate us on a deeper dive in the questions. The first chapter outlines the conduct of the inquiry. Chapter 2 builds on the preliminary technical overview provided in the interim report. It intends to convey some of the complexities associated with achieving secure and reliable electricity supply. Bringing it back to first principles, I believe market and regulatory frameworks should follow the physics. It's therefore important to outline the physical properties of electricity production and identify the features that are essential to system security. We can then consider the types of mechanisms required to secure their provision. Chapter 3 discusses WA's regulatory environment. It's complex and for very good reason. Electricity is a deadly product, an essential service, and the traditional model used to produce and transport it is inherently monopolistic. The chapter describes the major acts governing the industry, the conduct of the government trading enterprises, and the protection of consumers. It also identifies the participants, actors and stakeholders who influence or have a direct or indirect interest in the development of microgrids and DER in WA. Chapter 4 observes that at the most fundamental level, power systems require sufficient quantities of dispatchable and controllable energy resources and a number of other essential system services to maintain stability and supply, including frequency control, voltage management, inertial response and system restoration services. Regulations, technical rules and market structures have been designed in Western Australia to ensure that these features are available to the system operator, but they're based heavily on the traditional power system structure. Chapter 4 examines how market and regulatory frameworks operate to supply electricity and the ways in which those frameworks are now being challenged by microgrids and distributed energy resources. I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with the infamous duck curve. The report discusses changing demand factors and patterns and finds that distributed energy resources are having an operational impact on the power system, causing traditional assets to operate differently. We raise concerns about costs and inefficiencies that are associated with this. Chapter 4 also considers network regulation and finds it problematic. One of the key findings in the report is that Western Australia's regulatory and market structures no longer reflect the physical realities of Western Australia's electricity system and may not operate to send the most efficient signals for asset development and system operations. Chapter 5 takes a closer look at technical and operational factors, highlighting the importance of operator visibility and control over distributed energy assets connected at the sub-transmission level. We note that government and regulatory agency support for advanced metering infrastructure is essential to evolve Western Australia's energy systems, facilitate system security and encourage efficient asset development and utilisation. We endorse the development of the DER roadmap and the whole of system plan by the Energy Transformation Task Force, considering that a system-wide plan for the SWIS will provide a strong evidentiary base for energy policy development in Western Australia and should inform future market and regulatory reforms aimed at promoting secure, reliable, sustainable and affordable energy supply. Chapter 6 focuses on policy, market and regulatory reform. At one stage, it was 75,000 words long. I had to cut an awful lot of content out, which again was why I was feeling a little fragile in November. We observe in that chapter that since the establishment of the wholesale electricity market in the mid-2000s, no government has undertaken a significant reform process to restructure markets or regulatory frameworks. The state government, we believe, therefore has an opportunity to both facilitate new technologies and commercial models and also address a range of long-standing structural issues in the market. The overwhelming weight of evidence presented to the committee supported reform to the electricity industry and urged timely action. There was also a high degree of consistency on the key principles that should underpin the reform process. We've endorsed the objectives underpinning the state government's energy transformation strategy to maintain a secure and reliable electricity supply, ensure affordable electricity for households and businesses, reduce energy sector emissions, transition affected coal workers in the Collie region, and promote local jobs and growth. A range of other principles also emerge from the evidence to this inquiry. That the policy framework must be flexible and capable of adapting and encouraging technological change over time, that policy should provide clear direction and certainty for industry, that energy solutions should be selected on a technologically neutral, economically efficient and cost-effective basis, and that the private sector should play a key role in the energy supply chain. The committee considers that these broad principles should also inform the process of energy market reform. The evidence suggested 4 key areas to maximise the benefits from microgrid technologies, and again we did have to pare back the market reform section of the report. We focused on market roles, market rules, economic regulation, and network and retail prices. On roles, the committee considered that the 3 government trading enterprises, Horizon Power, Synergy and Western Power, and found there's considerable scope for duplication and overlap between them. We've recommended that the Minister provide clear and unequivocal direction regarding the GTE's functions and accountabilities. We also found that the private sector has a vital role to play. A number of innovative companies can supply a range of technologies and services, and many successful partnerships now exist with the GTEs. Our report discusses other proposals for virtual power plants, blockchain technologies and community energy cooperatives. There are also commercial opportunities associated with the provision of essential system services. The challenge is to ensure that the GTEs create the space for private sector participation in their product development and procurement processes, and also that the wholesale electricity market sends signals that encourage competition and technologically neutral participation. The committee has found that electricity market price signals should align with system reliability and security requirements, and that electricity traded through the wholesale electricity market mechanisms should reflect the true costs of production. However, the evidence to this inquiry has demonstrated that WA's market structures are increasingly ill-suited to an emerging distributed energy model. Market and regulatory structures are sending inefficient blunt signals and contain skewed incentives that drive uneconomic generation and network asset configuration and utilisation. Market reform is complex. We chose to limit our rules discussion to 3 high-level aspects relevant to microgrids: essential system services, microgrid participation in market structures, and the role of batteries. The evidence to the committee suggested that the wholesale electricity market does not currently send efficient signals for the supply of a range of essential system services. In the WEM, it's been an open question whether specific granular markets for all essential services are required, or whether it's sufficient simply to make the provision of these energy supply characteristics a compulsory aspect of connection or participation in electricity markets. In some cases, it may also be appropriate to have mechanisms that are not complex real-time markets, but nonetheless exert competitive pressure at some point in the procurement process to encourage efficient outcomes. We discussed the Energy Transformation Task Force's proposed changes for the provision of essential system services. They mark a significant step towards securing the supply of a broader range of services and introduce mechanisms to encourage more cost-reflective and economically efficient supply. They create markets where the scale and depth of the WEM are sufficient to support them, but also allow for the incorporation of market forces into longer-term central procurement processes where a real-time or shorter-term market may lead to gaming, abuse of market power, or may discourage the entry of more appropriate forms of technology. Batteries are particularly exciting. I got one in Ellenbrook the other week. Thanks, Jason. Grid-scale batteries are rapidly demonstrating their capacity to assist with secure and reliable system operations. Battery assets can be developed through partnerships between the GTEs and the private sector, and if market reform progresses, opportunities can arise for discrete battery-based services from market participants. The committee also considered whether electricity network regulation encourages microgrid technologies. The evidence suggests that it does not incentivise the most efficient asset development or utilisation. Strong signals exist to expand network assets rather than consider alternative technologies. We've recommended that the Minister for Energy expand the role of incentive-based mechanisms to encourage cost-effective alternatives to traditional pole and wire solutions. Evidence also suggested that the administration of regulatory processes is problematic. The committee finds there's scope for better consultation and collaboration through the development of access arrangements, and we note the genuine need at this time of radical transformation for more innovative regulatory approaches that acknowledge the importance of investing in innovation, research, and new technologies. The evidence to the inquiry also strongly suggests that network and retail tariffs should be reviewed. Network tariffs no longer incentivise efficient investment, and retail tariffs for small use customers do not reflect the actual costs of electricity supply. Witnesses maintained that tariff reform, both network and retail, is essential if the full benefits of microgrids and associated technologies are to be realised. The committee agrees that time of use and locational tariffs would provide signals about the impact of electricity consumption patterns and the costs of supply at particular points in the South West Interconnected System. Network tariff reform, we believe, should be included in the Energy Transformation Task Force's scope of works. With respect to retail tariffs, successive Western Australian governments have upheld the application of the Uniform Tariff Policy, whereby metropolitan and regional small-use customers pay the same retail tariff for electricity, irrespective of actual supply cost. For decades, through the UTP, metropolitan consumers have subsidised the extremely high cost to serve regional customers. There's a heat map in the report that's absolutely fascinating that shows that the relative costs of metropolitan supply versus regional supply. And when you consider that 52% of assets that Western Power possess serve 3% of the population, I think there's a really important debate to be had there. To the extent that microgrid technologies reduce or place downward pressure on those costs, the UTP should also ensure that Western Australians share the benefits. So for those who've borne the costs for all this time, if there are downward pressure on prices delivered through the adoption of these technologies, I think it's only fair that we all benefit in that change. We've recommended that Synergy undertake retail tariff trials for small use customers to determine whether signals sent through retail tariff structures would change consumer behaviour and promote more secure, reliable and affordable electricity supply. There were some unforeseen outworkings from Horizon Power's regional trials and particularly impacts on consumers, and it's important to understand whether the results that were seen in Horizon Power's networks would be replicated in the Swiss. Evidence also arose regarding broader structural issues associated with retail contestability thresholds. Support for change came from existing and potential private retailers. Opposition centred on the impacts on regional customers and concerns about market structures and anti-competitive conduct. A range of recent publications questioned the benefits of full retail contestability in the national electricity market. Studies have highlighted additional costs, such as duplicated overhead, call centres and advertising spend, all of which add little or no value to the production and delivery of electricity to consumers. Studies have also raised issues around product confusion and anti-competitive market behaviours. Competition is an important driver of innovation and can promote efficient asset development and utilisation, lowering system-wide costs and placing downward pressure on price. It undoubtedly works at points in the electricity supply chain and should be encouraged where appropriate. It's not, however, an end in itself. The East Coast experience demonstrates that it's highly questionable whether loading consumers up with the additional costs associated with full retail contestability actually contributes to a more secure, reliable, sustainable and, importantly, affordable electricity system. The committee has found that capturing the system-wide benefits offered by microgrids and associated technologies is not dependent on alterations to contestability thresholds, and moreover, that any changes to contestability thresholds should only be introduced where it can be clearly and unequivocally demonstrated that this will place downward pressure on prices and deliver system-wide benefits that can be equitably shared. Chapter 7 of the report focuses on consumers. An increasingly consumer-centric energy system raises a number of complex regulatory and policy challenges. Access to DER is not equitable, and energy poverty continues to challenge policymakers. The social impacts of this inequitable access are significant, given that low-income households tend also to consume more energy. Electricity market reform is essential to support the transition to a more cost-effective system. However, the committee has found that reform should be accompanied by a wholesale review of supports and concessions. Small energy consumers also require consumer protections, recognising the essential service characteristic of electricity, its traditionally monopolistic industry structure, the significant disparity in bargaining power and sophistication between provider and customer, and the extreme danger inherent in energy supply. In the committee's view, microgrid operators should be subject to the state's electricity licensing regime. Consumer voices also must be heard in energy policy processes. We also had a look at a range of broader opportunities. As cost profiles shift and increasing volumes of energy are delivered at low to zero marginal cost, there's an obvious opportunity to attract industries with complementary load profiles. The people of Western Australia also own highly valuable assets in the form of microgrid-related intellectual property and the delivery capability possessed by the GTEs. These valuable assets could be readily commercialised in partnership with the private sector and research institutions, providing us, who have paid so long for these companies, with a direct return on the substantial investments we've made over the years. Demand exists both in Australia and overseas for microgrid technologies and is likely to increase as our neighbours develop and electrify their rural communities and adopt ambitious carbon abatement and renewable energy targets. We could also leverage our microgrid capacity, harnessing the technology, expertise, capability and thought leadership of recognised energy leaders through the establishment of an advanced microgrid centre of excellence. Microgrids offer Western Australia the opportunity to optimise our electricity systems, export our valuable IP, all whilst reducing our carbon intensity. As nations around the world act to address climate change and demand more sustainable forms of electricity production, Western Australia has demonstrated its world-leading capacity to meet this market. We can build a thriving industry, leveraging the knowledge and benefits gained through our own transition to a more sustainable energy economy. I want to finally briefly mention a few unique advantages that we hold over other Australian jurisdictions. Our separation from the NEM provides the ability to reform market structures and regulatory processes to suit our specific circumstances and in light of the needs of all Western Australians. The WA government does not need to negotiate with the Commonwealth and state governments. It can proceed despite the toxicity and total energy policy dysfunction being displayed by the Commonwealth. Western Australia can also observe the adverse consequences of NEM reform processes and take steps to avoid them. Moreover, the state's ownership of the GTEs enables us to pursue broader public policy objectives and facilitate the changes underway in the sector in the interests of all Western Australians by directing the GTE's activities and their forms of participation in energy markets. This would not have been possible had we privatised Western Power. Here, the people of Western Australia own Western Power, enabling the state government to make decisions about the network with a broad range of energy policy objectives in mind, rather than having to accommodate the albeit legitimate profit motives of private shareholders. Network regulation and asset return structures can change without the need to negotiate with or compensate multiple private network owners. The state can direct Western Power's and Synergy's market activities to create opportunities for new market participants where private operators would otherwise be highly incentivised to leverage monopoly assets, dominant market positions, or exploit the advantages of incumbency. The interim report observed the benefits of possessing a clear line of sight from electron production right the way through to consumption. We are the last state in the nation to possess this capacity, and it rests in the GTEs. Of all states and territories, Western Australia is uniquely positioned to take charge of its energy future. More than any other time, there's a need for government, industry, academia, and the broader community to work together to understand and benefit from a distributed energy future. We can deliver a more secure, reliable, affordable, and sustainable electricity system. Together, we can create commercial opportunities that encourage innovation, new market entrants and new industries, whilst moving to a more sustainable energy economy and facing the challenges presented by climate change. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jess, for giving us that overview to your paper. The AIE asked me to make just a couple of remarks and then facilitate the question and answer session. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to hit Jess with. I've given a heads up on at least one of them, but I don't have a full list of questions, so I'm going to depend upon you to come up with some. Looking at the faces in this audience, I don't think that will be a problem. I do need to let you know that Jess said to me before we started, you know, she's one of us. She's an industry insider, and so she was hoping that you'd be gentle with her. I take a different view of that. She's one of us. She knows what she's talking about, so I'd go hard with your questions. Just a couple of thoughts about the work that the committee did and sort of where we sit today. This is obviously an exciting time for regulatory nerds Jess and I have found each other, and it's certainly an exciting time. For me personally, it's a chastening time, perhaps looking back at some of the things we've put in place over the last couple of decades and how we didn't necessarily fully anticipate the way the world was going to develop. It's a frustrating time, looking at some of the things that we tried to put in place that haven't quite worked. I find network access a particularly frustrating issue. Watching projects not get off the ground, move over east. There's a whole range of factors involved in that, and we'll talk about a little bit of that, I think. But that's clearly an area that I think, as a community, as a regulatory community, we could have done better. And there are certainly challenges ahead of us. One of the challenges is just the absolute volume of reform, the volume of information, the load that is being put on everyone in this room trying to manage the reform process, deal with the consultation that is going on. A few years ago, industry, with some considerable justification, was complaining about the lack of consultation. Now there's almost as much complaint about the volume of consultation and the pace of change and the pace of consultation. One of the things, Jess, that I think your committee has done is gather together a tremendous amount of information. I boggle at what was in the other 75,000 words. So we'll no doubt hear a little bit about that over time. I think, as Jess says, the current government has really leapt into the reform program. If we look back just a couple of years at where we were and where we weren't and where we're moving now, I personally like to think that that's actually the then Minister stole my most able lieutenant, Katie, and so I think that's really what kicked off the reforms that are underway now, so I'd like to take a small amount of credit for that. A little observation perhaps to the people in this room. A typical, if you distill down what a lot of private sector submissions to government are in all reform processes and just generally, it's about, please give me an opportunity to make money. And that's a perfectly legitimate objective, and that's what the private sector is about. And it's the opportunity to make money that drives the innovation, that drives the investment that we need. But as Jess has laid out, and as the paper lays out, and as other reform documents lay out, as an industry, we face genuine challenges. The government faces genuine challenges, and the government's got a broader responsibility to the people of the state than just giving our individual businesses an opportunity to make money. And so I think, as industry participants, putting our proposals to government, whether it's a reform proposal or a request for a permission or an exemption or whatever it might be, we need to be thinking about the fact that the government has a responsibility to govern for all the people of Western Australia. It is only going to listen to submissions that help it towards that objective. And that's perhaps a different mindset to what the mindset one normally adopts in participating in these processes. So it needs to be, you need to show a path forward that actually recognises those other broader objectives. That, as Jess said, the government's made it very clear that it's seeking to find benefit for all the people of Western Australia, not necessarily just the particular customer group that you're trying to target. A quick observation, there are structural flaws in the industry at the moment. There are structural flaws in our tariffs, as Jess's report makes clear. A bit of free advice. If you've got a business model that is either trying to get off the ground or is off the ground that depends upon arbitraging structural flaws in tariffs or gaps in regulations, I'd be making hay while the sun is shining, because I think those gaps are going to be being changed, and I'd be factoring that into your business planning. And before I jump to asking the questions, perhaps a final observation. I think we need a whole bunch of regulatory change, and I think one of the points that Jess's report brings out that is a really important point is we also need cultural change. We need cultural change in our regulators, we need cultural change in our government trading enterprises, and those two go together and they feed off each other. And so part of what our regulatory reforms need to achieve is the cultural change that is necessary to enable some of the innovation that we need. So, enough from me. Let's start with a really easy question, Jess, and you've sort of touched on this. I think and I've got to put to you a proposition to react to. I think the elephant in the corner, in fact, it's probably the elephant that's dancing on the table, in a lot of what's going on in our sector at the moment is the question of asset valuation. It is an accepted wisdom that needs to be forgotten, and we need to think again, that tariffs should be built up from asset valuations. I think actually what we need to do is to get to a world in which asset valuations are an output, not an input to that process. But to get to there, we have to separate two questions. And the question of how you value services and what that implies about the value of the assets that are used to provide those services, we need to separate that from the much harder question of if that means there's a change in the value of assets, who wears that change? And so, Jess, I ask you to comment on that gnarly question.
Thanks for taking it so easy with me up front. Look, it is. It's a very material issue. It's interesting when having in a past life had a look at Western Power and look at various transmission assets that sit around the place. Try going into any global financial market at the moment and securing project finance for a regulated transmission asset, given the extent of change underway in the industry. You can't sell a transmission network and then a couple of years later completely change its revenue base and the way indeed it's valued, full stop. These are very material issues, and I think what highlights for me is that we really do need more innovative approaches to network regulation, and focusing on a services-based model I think would be a very interesting way to conceive of the value in the network here.
All right. One last question from me. So we've got a roving mic down the back, so start putting your hand up if you want to be the first to have a go. So Ken can be rushing towards you with a microphone while I ask this one.
If you have a go, you'll get a go.
This is a multi-partisan report, Jess, not a bipartisan, as I've written down here. And look, I think credit needs to go to your committee members, and particularly Terry Redmond. When I was working with the committee, they were all engaged. But I need to give a particular acknowledgement to Terry, who clearly worked very hard to get on top of this difficult subject, and we know how difficult it is. It's nonetheless, it's a political piece of work because you're all politicians. And without suggesting specifically, I'm talking about your report. When one is writing a report in a politically sensitive environment, there are sometimes things one wants to say but can't quite say out loud. So one sometimes refers to them obliquely and hopes that the audience really picks up the message that you're trying to get at. Without suggesting for a moment that applies specifically to your report, Jess, are there any particular passages that you're hoping the audience doesn't miss when they read your paper?
Yeah, thanks again, Matt. Look, I really want to actually pay credit to the level of engagement and collaboration that we had on this inquiry, and take my hat off to Terry Redmond. Like he is a truly he's an excellent politician. He's an excellent policy maker, and certainly engaged with me incredibly constructively through the process. Look, have a look at everybody's tabling speeches, and that'll give you a bit of an indication of the curlier issues. If anybody has had a look at the forward and then read my tabling speech, there's a different tone, and particularly around the issue of full retail contestability. I have to respect the fact that the Liberal position seems to be hung up on full retail contestability. There are observations and points that need to be made about it, however, and when we considered the evidence, we were able to come up with a consensus view. So that was testing my new skills as a politician, navigating through those discussions. But yeah, look, FRC was something that certainly I have some very firm views on, and the committee did manage to get some views on that. And the other interesting points, I think, was the benefits of line of sight. And we made that finding in the interim report about the benefits of being able to see right the way through from generation of electricity through to consumption, being able to have those conversations with your customers about what their needs and drivers are, how they might respond to signals differently, which will in turn dictate the way you set your entire energy system up. As I say, we're the only place left that still has that, and it's valuable, and the committee has found that. So they're the sorts of things I think that I tiptoed around a little.
Cheers, thank you. So do we have a hand up already for a question?
Well, Zoran Božić, retired engineer. In order to achieve the reform that you are claiming that we wish for, we seem to have forgotten the innovation potential of engineers. I haven't seen any Engineers Australia submission in your report. And second thing is, we have to make sure that each decision can be challenged. That means that there is that to be challenged on the basis of the publicly stated objectives, such as the most cost-efficient solution and overall cheapest solution for the society, regardless where the cost lies to. So my question is, can we make that change?
Thanks for the question. We didn't get, so we can only, we can't force people to provide us with submissions. What I will say is the IEEE, the Power and Energy Society, were absolutely fantastic. Certainly spent a lot of time as well hanging out with AEMO's engineers. The IEEE PES invited me to Singapore and I spent a lot of time at their International Smart Grids convention. They also facilitated workshops with the Singapore market, the energy market operator in Singapore, and they also facilitated our visit, or my visit, to a smart grid research facility on Jurong Island. Again, the IEEE in the United States provided us with an extraordinarily comprehensive briefing. They flew people in from all over the US to talk to us about the engineering and technical aspects of this inquiry. So I geeked out on it. It was fascinating, and certainly my own knowledge has improved through the course of this inquiry, and I know my colleagues have. On your second question, I think that very much on the ability to challenge decisions, that very much depends on the regulatory framework that we have in place. I think, as I say, a shift towards incentive-based regulation. I think the government has also flagged as part of its reforms that it introduced into the Parliament in November that it will require amendments to the business case development processes for Synergy and Horizon Power, and that it expects reform to the Electricity Network Access Code as well. So you can start testing and challenging the technical veracity of proposals that are put forward. That's my understanding, at least, anyway. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, it does. But what I think that individuals should be able to challenge, not just big corporations or institutional members. Basically, if we give power to the people as we give equal power to corporations, that would achieve the objective.
We did in the final chapter, and look, this is, I think, actually this really highlights one of the real challenges in this inquiry. So, because I had such limited time this morning, I didn't really go into chapter 7. But the consumer-centric model that we have emerging and how we listen, how we engage and hear the voices of the consumer, that's a real challenge in this space. And how it would be facilitated is really, I think the GTEs have a big role to play in that space because they do have the consumer relationship, so Synergy and Horizon Power, and to a certain degree Western Power as well. But yeah, I take your point that listening to consumer voices is very important.
Liz, I think, is next.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you very much. Liz Aitken from Perth Energy. With regards to your line of sight question, Jessica, what's your position on the sharing of information from these numerous and countless trials that have been and are still continuing to be undertaken with the broader energy industry?
Look, can I actually first of all congratulate Perth Energy on its submission and the evidence to the inquiry. It was absolutely so refreshing to have a private sector participant, A, engage, and B, so constructively. Some really genuinely thought-provoking propositions were put to us, and so thank you. Thank you for being so open as we sort of tested various aspects of your market participation. Look, definitely more scope for information sharing. It was one of the major motivations behind the recommendation for setting up the Advanced Microgrid Centre of Excellence, because there is an opportunity to share and benefit. These are particularly the capacities developed within the government trading enterprises. They're public assets and they're valuable, and they can assist us to participate in so many other markets. So I do think there is genuinely more scope for information sharing and learning.
I think we've got time for about 2 more questions.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. David Parker, Albemarle Lithium. We're currently under the construction phase of a Kemerton lithium hydroxide project at Kemerton, outside of Bunbury in the southwest. Jessica, just with respect to the report, how do you see microgrids impacting on the electrification of transport, and how important do you think they'll be as we go through this next phase of transport evolution or revolution?
We had a brief look at electric vehicles in the interim report, but it's probably one of the less mature or less developed parts of the inquiry. The scope was really quite broad. We would have loved to have done a deeper dive into the impact of EV, equally also hydrogen. That was something where we had evidence put to us as well, but just didn't have the time, the scope to inquire into hydrogen. Look, I think you'd be crazy if you didn't think it was going to produce quite significant changes in our energy production model, but we, as I say, we didn't take as much of a look at it, although we did go to the Tesla factory in California and it was absolutely awesome.
One last question. There must be in the room. The microphone's coming just for the people down the back.
Yeah, sorry, I'm loud enough normally. Congratulations
So
on...
is your suit.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, touche. Well done. Everyone needs a brand, right? Thanks very much for the report. I wondered whether you think that there are lessons in your report for complementary networks as well. So I think the microgrid concept, also often people talk about it in terms of water supply, maybe complementary gas networks and the like. Do you sort of see some interplay? Did you get much sort of thoughts and feedback on that during your inquiry?
I had no evidence on that whatsoever. When you start thinking about scale, fleet management, personnel management, there are benefits in multi-utilities that I know a few people have thought about around the place. Certainly I can see that there would be benefits, but we didn't get any evidence on that directly, no.
All right, I think that I've got a few other questions here that I really wanted to ask, but Jess will escape. I think that just about takes us to time. Murray, you coming up to say a few closing words? Good stuff, thank you.
Would you all join with me, please, in thanking both Matthew and Jessica. And I have a gift card for Jessica, which I am assured is compliant with gifting policies for politicians.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you. Thanks.
AIE exists to foster a better understanding of energy issues in Australia. We're a small institute, but we're a particularly busy one. In the last financial year, the 3 combined groups in Perth, that's young energy professionals, women in energy and us more mature people, we ran 26 events attracting 1,600 registrations, and we hope to do even better this year. The Women in Energy group ran a very successful networking event on 13th of February on the paddle steamer Decoy. You may have seen that in our background slides. It was wonderful networking in the steam age. Coming up, we have 3 events in March and April. Women in Energy kick off on the 9th of March with an event and a panel coinciding with International Women's Day, while the young energy professionals have a fantastic panel coming up, Energy Politics 101, with special guests including at our own table here, Eric Ripper, Colin Barnett, Jason Marocchi, Michelle Shepherd from AEMC, and it will be facilitated by Matt McKenzie from Business News. Watch out for that one. 8th of April, save the date, the DER roadmap presented by the project director, Jai Thomas. In September, we will hold our annual 2-day energy conference, the best energy conference in WA. Planning is well underway. The dates are locked in, 23-24 September, and we're now chasing speakers and sponsorship. Over 30 speakers on 2 days, and I urge you to start thinking about the opportunities there. And finally, if you have a suggestion for a topic or a guest speaker, we'd love to hear about it, and this is an opportunity. Could I ask the Aie Committee members here to stand up, please? So, if you like to grab one of those people, if you have a suggestion, we are all volunteers and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you all for coming. Have a great day and watch out for the thunderstorms. Cheers.